Okay, before we kick off our discussion of communities, let's cover a few more basic ecology terms. And the two I really want to focus on are habitat and niche because they tend to be used interchangeably and they're a little bit different. So when you're looking at habitat, you're looking at the entire physical environment to which a species has adapted and which it can survive. So those are things like what temperature ranges it can survive, how much rainfall a place gets, because some, especially your plant species need a particular amount of rainfall, a particular amount of sunlight, and then you have all your animal species that would rely on a certain set of plant species. And so the habitat is the first factor to consider. Niche is a little bit narrower. It tells you a little bit more about the species. And so that's the role an organism plays in its environment. And so there's a couple of things to consider here. Most importantly, the food it gets, how it gets its food, and the shelter it occupies. So you're looking at when it's awake, where it shelters itself, exactly which species it can and cannot prey on, and what species prey on it. And so if you look on something, if you look at a species like a warbler, we've actually studied this and we found that multiple species of warbler can exist together in a single species of evergreen. So they're living together, but they each have their own slightly different role. Some can live in those upper parts of the branches where it's warmer, you get a lot more wind, you get a lot more sunlight, versus some need that shelter of the lower branches inside, those long branches, you get a lot less wind, a lot more shelter from the environment. And so every species can carve out its own little niche and reduce competition that way. And that's where this kind of starts to creep into a community consideration, is when you're looking at competition. There's also the fundamental versus the realized niche to consider. So we've studied this in barnacles. You have the sea barnacle that actually has a very wide niche it can occupy, and that's its fundamental niche. So it can live anywhere between the upper and middle intertidal zones. But when the bee barnacle is present, it has a much smaller niche that it occupies, and that's its realized niche, because it can live in that higher tidal zone where it's getting less water throughout the day. So the edge it has is that it can survive that drying out. And so even when that stronger competitor, the bee barnacle, is there, it can still survive. And so they both can coexist together, living in their realized niches. And that leads us to the competitive exclusion principle, that no two species can occupy the same niche in the same place at the same time. And this always makes me think of humans and the economy and jobs, because nobody can go out into the workforce and work the exact same job and play the exact same role in the same company at the same office at the same time. So people will work different shifts, or they'll work in different offices in different cities doing similar or the same job. But that applies to people as well as animals, because if you are living in the same niche, in the same place at the same time, there's just too much competition. So you've got a couple of options. You can beat out another species, you can adapt to a slightly different niche to minimize competition, or you can die. And so that's the, you're not a very successful living thing if you are not able to do one of the first two options here. So that's the competitive exclusion principle. And so you see that competitive pressure leading to natural selection and adapting to slightly new niches. The problem is invasive species. They move in to a brand new place. They already have a particular niche they occupied in the place that they were native to, but they come into a new place and they have no natural competition, no natural predators, and they kind of take over. And they take over so quickly that the species that are native can't adapt fast enough often to survive. So this is a serious problem. We see a lot of local extinctions come from this. So here's one example of an invasive species. This is kudzu. Your book refers to it as the plant that ate Georgia. As a southerner, I'm pretty familiar with this plant. Kudzu was started, we planted it on purpose. It was a soil erosion control agent, and it did its job far too well. It grew too fast, it rooted in too often, and so now we're seeing it just grow over and take the sunlight away from all our native plant species. And that, in the picture there, is a house, I believe, that it's growing on top of. Here's another problem in the United States. That's a python. In the Everglades, these pythons that were brought mainly to be pets, and then they get too big and people release them into the wild, they are finding a great habitat to thrive in the Florida Everglades, and this one is attempting to eat a deer. So that gives you an idea. I think this is a 10-foot python. It's unhinged its jaws, and it is trying to eat a deer. So it is a huge problem in Florida that they're trying to deal with, because if it's eating the deer, it's taking, it can eat that and anything smaller that it could subsist on. So it's consuming the prey for a variety of other animals in those natural food webs. And so we really need to deal with and be aware of invasive species if we want to have stable, healthy communities.